In the early hours of a summer morning in Stafford, Virginia, a 2-year-old boy disappeared from his third-floor apartment without a sound. Footsteps were heard. Doors were checked. Yet the child remained unseen. The community feared the worst, unaware that the boy was closer than anyone imagined. How could a toddler vanish so completely in a place thought to be secure, leaving only silence behind? Over Stafford Lakes, a quiet apartment community where most residents knew each other's schedules, their routines, and even the sound of their children playing outside. It was the kind of place where people felt comfortable leaving windows cracked open for the breeze, and where footsteps in the hallway were familiar rather than alarming. That is why what happened in the early hours of July 26th felt so out of place with the rhythm of the neighborhood. It began as an ordinary night for the Hill family, a young couple trying to balance work, long shifts, and raising a spirited 2-year-old boy named Dakota. They spent the late hours unwinding on the living room floor, watching a movie that their toddler favored for reasons only a child could explain. Exhaustion eventually overtook them. Around 4 a.m, all three fell asleep in the same spot, the television still glowing in the dim room. When Leah and John woke later that morning, something felt off before either of them fully understood what. The room was quiet. Too quiet for a home with a child who was almost always in motion. A parent learns to recognize the difference between silence that means rest and silence that suggests something is missing. Within seconds, they were calling his name, scanning corners, checking behind furniture, and opening every closet door. There was no sign of him. The front door, which they believed they had secured before settling down for the night, was slightly ajar. That single detail shifted the atmosphere inside the apartment from confusion to a deep, rising fear. Their first thought was simple and instinctive. He might have wandered outside and slipped away from view. They ran down the steps of their third-floor unit and searched the immediate landing, then the grassy area below, expecting to see him sitting somewhere, perhaps examining a bug or a stone the way toddlers do. But the small lawn was empty. There was no cry, no movement, no flash of the familiar shirt he had worn hours earlier. They checked the parking lot, hoping he might be near a familiar car, but he was not there either. As minutes became longer than they should have been, the fear sharpened. A 2-year-old does not simply disappear, especially not in an enclosed apartment complex at dawn. Something was wrong. A neighbor living directly beneath them later said she had heard what sounded like small footsteps above her head around 4:30 a.m., followed by the faint click of a door closing. At the time, she thought little of it. Early morning sounds in family homes were common, especially with children. Only later would that detail take on an entirely different weight. For the parents, though, that clue had not yet surfaced. All they knew was that their son was nowhere in sight. They widened their search, calling his name through hallways and across the shared courtyard. Other residents heard the calls and joined in, some still in their sleepwear, some already beginning their day. People knocked on doors, checked stairwells, looked behind dumpsters, and peered between vehicles. Every passing minute deepened the sense that the situation was no longer just a case of a toddler wandering into an open space. The absence of any trace, no toy, no sound, no trail, felt almost unnatural. The fear that settled in the community spread quickly. Small children sometimes wander, but they rarely move far without being seen. This was a densely populated building where someone was always awake at unusual hours. Yet no one had seen a child moving through the walkways or climbing the stairs. That silence, combined with the open door, fueled a different kind of worry. Parents began pulling their own children indoors. Residents started asking if anyone had noticed unfamiliar cars earlier that night, or someone standing outside longer than usual. The situation shifted from concern to urgency, as if the disappearance of one child meant the safety of all children in the complex needed reconsidering. Meanwhile, Leah and John experienced a form of panic that exhausts the body even as it sharpens the senses. They retraced their steps repeatedly, as if a second look might reveal something the first had missed. They checked the laundry room, the mail area, and even the bushes lining the sidewalk. No matter how unlikely, every possibility had to be checked. When they finally contacted authorities, the emotion in their voices made clear that this was not a misunderstanding or a child hiding under a table. Their son was genuinely missing, and the window for finding him quickly was already narrowing. The earliest officers to arrive understood the weight of the moment. The combination of an open door, a missing toddler, and the absence of early leads created a scenario that demanded swift action. While the parents attempted to steady themselves enough to answer questions, the officers surveyed the area with trained eyes. They looked for footprints, small smudges on railings, or any sign that the child had moved across the property. The results were unsettling. Nothing conclusive, nothing reliable. It was as though he had stepped out of sight, and the world had swallowed the evidence behind him. By the time the initial search perimeter was defined, the atmosphere had changed completely from the calm of a summer morning to the tension of a community standing on edge. The idea that a toddler could vanish without a sound made every second feel heavier. As volunteers gathered and officers coordinated their next steps, the fear beneath every decision was the same. Without a clear starting point, finding him could take far longer than his family could bear. And so, within a single morning, the simple act of waking up had turned into the beginning of a crisis. A child had disappeared. A family was in shock. A community had begun to question its sense of safety. And as the search widened beyond the walls of the apartment complex, one truth settled over everyone present. The hours ahead would be critical, and the answers were nowhere in sight. When the missing child call officially reached the sheriff's office, the tone of the response changed instantly. A child as young as 2 wandering into unknown areas created a narrow window for safe recovery, and officers moved quickly to assess the situation. The first team on scene established a structured search perimeter, marking the courtyard, the stairwells, and the parking areas as the closest zones to be swept. At the same time, an officer began gathering background information from the parents. When they last saw their son, whether he had ever tried to open the door before, whether he knew the surroundings well, and whether any nearby residents owned pets or items that might attract a curious toddler. These initial questions, though simple, carried significant weight. Their purpose was to narrow down the direction in which a child might naturally drift. Yet with every answer given, the uncertainty seemed to widen. There was no favorite spot he tended to run toward, no playground he tried to visit alone, no predictable pattern that could guide the search. Within the first hour, the sheriff's office issued a request for immediate assistance from neighboring units. The reasoning was clear. If the child had wandered into the wooded areas surrounding the complex or toward nearby roads, the distance he could cover, even with small, uneven steps, might place him beyond sight quickly. Volunteers responded in large numbers. Some were neighbors who had been present since the early minutes, while others arrived after hearing the news. The summer heat intensified, creating a sense of urgency that pressed against every decision made by the search coordinators. Water stations were set up. Maps were spread across makeshift tables. Radio channels were assigned. The operation shifted from a neighborhood search to a structured effort that resembled the early stages of a large-scale rescue mission. As the hours passed, the search expanded outward in systematic rings. Officers moved through wooded patches, scanning the underbrush for signs of movement or small footprints. Others checked drainage areas, utility corridors, and spaces beneath staircases. A group canvassed the trail leading toward a nearby commercial area, questioning early morning workers who might have seen something without realizing its importance. Some residents approached officers to express concern about unfamiliar vehicles seen in the complex days earlier. Others reported hearing doors shutting during the night. The investigators recorded each statement, not because they pointed to a clear direction, but because a case without leads required that nothing be dismissed too early. The possibility of an abduction, though not confirmed, could not be completely ignored. It hovered silently over the search, shaping the decisions of those in charge. Officers reviewed surveillance footage from 2 small businesses near the entrance of the complex, looking for vehicles that might have entered or exited during the early hours. Nothing conclusive appeared, yet the absence of clear evidence only raised the tension further. If the child were still within the immediate area, he should have been found by that point. If he had left the complex, then the search perimeter needed to extend much farther. To address this risk, the sheriff's office contacted federal partners for support. Agents arrived not as a declaration of a confirmed threat, but as a precaution to strengthen the search grid and improve coordination. They brought additional resources, trained teams, dogs capable of detecting scent trails, and communication equipment suited for covering wide ground. The forest perimeter surrounding the complex became a central focus. Volunteers fanned out in long lines, maintaining visual contact with one another while slowly moving forward. Voices called the boy's name in measured intervals, steady enough to be heard, gentle enough not to startle a frightened child if he were hiding. By midday, the heat became a secondary challenge. The search team rotated in shifts to prevent exhaustion. Hydration tents were placed in shaded spots. Still, the tension did not ease. The longer the search continued without progress, the more the unspoken fears spread through the crowd. Parents held their children close. Some shut their doors and watched from their windows, uneasy with the idea that a child could vanish in a matter of minutes. Others questioned whether someone inside the complex might have information they were not sharing. Officers kept these conversations quiet, but noted how fear shaped the atmosphere. A missing child was not only a personal crisis, it was a community-wide disruption that changed the way people looked at each other. Throughout the afternoon, investigators revisited each apartment where no one had answered during the first sweep. They knocked again, louder this time, prepared to use administrative entry if needed. But every door remained locked and silent. The search inside the complex came up empty once more. Meanwhile, canine units traced several possible trails before each one faded into inconclusive markers. A child who had walked only a short distance might leave a trail too faint for dogs to follow in the heat. That explanation brought little comfort. As daylight began to fade, the search reached a critical moment. The second 12 hours of a missing child case are often considered the most decisive. A command post was set up at the center of the complex, where maps showed the areas already combed and those awaiting another pass. Conversations were quieter now. Officers reviewed the morning's efforts and prepared for a nighttime operation, knowing visibility would drop and risks would increase. John and Leah remained close to the command area, answering questions when needed and waiting in the stillness between updates. Their faces reflected the strain of the day, fear sharpened by hope, and hope weakened by the absence of any sign of their child. As night approached, one fact settled over the entire operation. Despite the dozens of volunteers, the constant movement, and the wide perimeter already covered, there was still no trace of where the child had gone. Not a footprint, not a dropped item, not a witness who had seen him outside the building. It was as if the starting point of the search did not exist at all, and that realization carried a weight that pressed on every member of the team. They continued moving, continued looking, continued calling his name, but a quiet truth was forming beneath the surface of their efforts. The case was heading toward a depth of uncertainty that no one had expected when the morning began. By the second day, the disappearance of a 2-year-old child had shifted from an urgent search into a crisis that touched every person in the Stafford Lakes complex. The early hope of finding him somewhere nearby, perhaps asleep in a shaded corner or sitting quietly behind a stairwell, had faded. Instead, a heavier atmosphere settled over the community, shaped by growing questions that no one knew how to answer. News crews arrived and set up along the sidewalk, capturing footage of search teams entering wooded areas, volunteers forming human lines in the heat, and neighbors speaking anxiously to one another. Every interview seemed to carry the same message. The child should have been found by now. And because he had not, the fear beneath the surface deepened. For the Hill family, the weight of the situation grew hour by hour. Leah clutched a small blanket their son often carried, holding it tightly each time a team returned without news. John tried to stand still and answer officers' questions, but his eyes kept drifting toward the tree line, as if he expected to see a small figure stepping out of the brush at any moment. Their exhaustion was visible. Sleeplessness combined with hope that rose and fell unpredictably. They were surrounded by people wanting to help, yet they felt profoundly alone. The questions that ran through their minds, the same ones they had avoided saying out loud, were questions they feared even hearing. The broader community reacted in its own way. Residents who barely spoke to one another on ordinary days began gathering in small groups, exchanging observations about anything unusual they remembered from the night or days prior. Some recalled unfamiliar cars idling near the entrance. Others mentioned seeing people they did not recognize, walking across the courtyard. A few remembered doors opening and closing in the early morning, but had not looked closely enough to identify who it might have been. Every recollection, even those based on faint impressions, carried more weight than normal simply because there was so little else to examine. Over time, these fragments of conversation turned into speculation. Though the sheriff's office urged residents to avoid drawing conclusions, uncertainty developed its own momentum. Parents began keeping their children inside, even those who normally spent afternoons riding bicycles or playing near the shared playground. Conversations shifted from sympathy to worry. How could a toddler leave a building with multiple occupied units and pass through open areas without anyone noticing? Could someone inside the complex have knowledge they were not sharing? Such thoughts were not accusations, but a reflection of the community's inability to understand what had happened. When no answer is in sight, even ordinary occurrences begin to feel strange. Within the command post, investigators monitored this rising tension closely. They understood how fragile the atmosphere had become. Fear had a way of clouding judgment, and incorrect assumptions could quickly overshadow the facts. Officers remained firm in their communication. They reminded residents that the search was ongoing, that every lead was being reviewed, and that omissions or exaggerations could delay progress rather than speed it up. Yet even with clear instructions, the sense of urgency continued to spread. People wanted certainty, something the investigation could not yet provide. Search crews persisted through the afternoon heat. Their movements became more methodical, returning to areas already covered the previous day. Woods were searched a second and third time. Drainage tunnels were examined again. Volunteers tapped on storage doors in case a frightened child had sought refuge inside. Several teams examined the edges of nearby ponds, moving carefully so as not to disturb the ground. Nothing new appeared. Without a physical clue, every hour widened the possible radius of the child's path. The sheriff's office established new checkpoints along roads leading out of the complex, not because they believed he had traveled far, but because they could not overlook anything that might contribute to an answer. Through all of this, the emotional strain on the search teams grew. Many of the volunteers had children of their own. The possibility of discovering a clue brought them back again and again, yet the lack of any progress made the work feel heavier. The silence, especially, weighed on them. A child lost in a forest often responds to calls in some way, crying, rustling leaves, or making uncoordinated movements. But the woods remained still. Dogs followed potential scent trails that dissolved before they led anywhere meaningful. Each time that happened, handlers regrouped and tried. Again, knowing that scent can rise and disappear unpredictably in summer heat. As the sun began to set for the second time since the disappearance, conversations among volunteers shifted. Some wondered if the child had wandered beyond the complex much earlier than suspected. Others asked whether someone driving through the area might have seen him near the road. Theories rose and fell quickly, none supported by evidence, all fueled by the simple fact that the perimeter had yielded nothing. The deeper the uncertainty grew, the more the community imagined possibilities they had not considered the day before. News broadcasts that evening reflected the growing severity of the situation. Anchors spoke in calm voices, yet their reports emphasized the length of time that had passed without resolution. Viewers watching from outside Stafford County learned of the search, the heat, and the rapid mobilization of volunteers. Some arrived after seeing the reports, hoping to contribute to the effort. The attention strengthened the operation, but reminded everyone of how delicate the circumstances remained. As darkness settled, officers prepared for another night search. Flashlights, glow markers, and reflective vests were distributed. Volunteers formed groups and listened to instructions designed to prevent them from missing small signs in the grass or shrubbery. The command post lights glowed against the growing dusk, casting faint shadows across the pavement. The hills stood nearby, quiet now, their energy spent but their worry as sharp as ever. They remained ready to answer any new question, to revisit any timeline, to cooperate in any way they could, though each hour that passed without progress made the weight of the moment harder to carry. By the end of the second night, the community felt suspended between fear and hope. The search had been extensive, meticulous, and relentless, yet not a single clue pointed to where the child had gone after leaving his apartment. The absence of evidence formed a silence more unsettling than any single lead could have been. Something did not align. Either he was somehow still within the area but unseen, or he had moved in a way no one anticipated. Both possibilities were troubling. And as the search teams checked in one final time before midnight, it became clear that the case had entered a stage where the lack of clarity was its own challenge, pressing against every decision that would come next. By the time the search crossed the 48-hour mark, the command post had settled into a rhythm that mixed determination with a growing sense of fatigue. Volunteers still arrived, bringing water, flashlights, and quiet encouragement. But even they began to sense the emotional weight pressing down over the complex. The maps on the folding tables were marked with increasing stretches of red and blue ink, showing areas that had been searched not once, but multiple times. Officers reviewed logs, created new passes through wooded terrain, and checked traffic reports for any mention of a wandering child. Each action was carried out methodically, yet the silence from the perimeter remained absolute. The absence of progress created its own kind of tension, a feeling that perhaps the answer lay hidden in a place so ordinary that no one had thought to examine it again. Late Sunday evening, as the sky shifted from the heavy glare of summer sun into a muted orange, many volunteers prepared for another long night. The temperature, though beginning to fall, still held the residue of the day's heat. A few residents walked past the command area carrying bags of snacks for the search teams, offering a brief sense of normalcy in an otherwise strained atmosphere. It was then, in the middle of this subdued routine, that a voice cut through the low hum around the courtyard. Someone shouted a name, not in panic, but in disbelief. The sound carried across the complex with startling clarity. Several people turned instinctively toward the sidewalk near Building C, where a figure was pointing toward a small child walking unsteadily along the concrete path. The child's hair was tousled, his steps uneven, and his clothes were not the ones he had been wearing 2 days earlier. A moment of stillness gripped the onlookers as the realization sank in. The figure moving across the walkway was the boy they had been searching for. John reached him first. He ran with a mix of relief and fear, almost afraid that the image might dissolve if he moved too fast. But the child did not disappear. He looked up at his father with a blank, almost sleepy curiosity, as if he had woken from a long nap and stepped outside without understanding the commotion around him. When John picked him up, the boy leaned into his shoulder in a gesture so natural it brought tears from some of the volunteers watching nearby. It was the ending they had hoped for, but one that arrived in a way no one had predicted. For a few long seconds, the small group around the sidewalk stood frozen, unsure whether to cheer, cry, or simply let themselves breathe. Officers stepped forward with controlled urgency, checking the child's condition. His skin was warm but not overheated, his breathing steady, his demeanor calm. He seemed surprisingly at ease, showing none of the distress one might expect from a toddler who had been missing for 2 full days. He did not cling or tremble. Instead, he reached for a piece of equipment hanging from an officer's belt, examining it with the instinctive curiosity of a child encountering something new. Once the initial wave of emotion eased slightly, the officers began the crucial steps of documenting the moment. A paramedic examined him and confirmed that aside from a small cut on his foot and signs of mild dehydration, he was in stable condition. The child even pushed away a bottle of milk offered to him, turning instead to look at the bright lights of the emergency vehicles. It was an unexpected reaction, almost playful, and it left several observers momentarily speechless. After 2 days of imagining the worst, the scene unfolding before them felt surreal. As soon as the boy was secured safely with his parents, investigators turned their attention to the immediate surroundings. The question was obvious and pressing. Where had he come from? Officers scanned the walkway, checked the nearby stairwell, and looked for any door that might have opened seconds before his appearance. But no resident stepped forward, no door hung ajar, and no sign indicated a clear origin point. Some volunteers had seen him emerge from the direction of Building C's lower units, but none could say which one. The child himself, being only 2 years old, offered no answers. His short attention span and developing language made it impossible to determine anything through direct questioning. But the mystery of his sudden return was secondary to the relief gripping the community. Neighbors who had been fearful only hours earlier now stood in small clusters, processing the unexpected shift. The tension that had shaped the last 2 days softened almost instantly. People embraced, some wiped their eyes, others expressed gratitude in quiet, private ways. For many, the moment felt like a release from a prolonged breath they had been holding since Saturday morning. Yet for the investigators, relief was only one piece of the picture. They now faced a new challenge, understanding how a toddler had vanished for nearly 48 hours and reappeared within the confines of a complex that had been searched repeatedly. The next steps required the same careful approach as the search itself. Officers began preparing to re-interview residents, especially those who lived in units facing the walkway where the child had been found. They planned to check storage spaces again and revisit apartments where no one had answered during previous sweeps. The surprise of the boy's reappearance would need an explanation, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity, because understanding what had happened might prevent similar incidents in the future. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the complex, the command post shifted from crisis mode into recovery mode. Officers updated their logs, noted the child's condition, and began planning the next phase of inquiry. The volunteers gradually drifted away, many sharing quiet conversations as they walked to their cars. The Hills, still holding their son close, moved inside with medical staff accompanying them for a final evaluation. Though the search had ended, the story clearly had not. The boy's sudden appearance raised just as many questions as his disappearance had. And in the hours ahead, investigators would begin uncovering the unexpected truth that lay just beneath the familiar exterior of the complex, one that no one had imagined when the search first began. When the boy was carried safely into the family living room and the immediate relief began settling over the complex, investigators shifted to the step that needed to happen next, identifying where he had spent the past 2 days. The search operation had been too extensive, too methodical, for him to have simply remained outside without being noticed. The answer had to be somewhere within the structure of the buildings themselves. Officers revisited the ground floor units of Building C, paying particular attention to those that had remained unanswered during previous knocks. With the child now safe, they could afford to take a slower, more deliberate look. The timing proved almost uncanny. Just as investigators prepared to make a more assertive entry into one of the locked units, a car pulled into the parking lot. A man stepped out, carrying a small cooler and a beach towel over his shoulder. He looked confused by the number of patrol cars, the cluster of people, and the quiet tension in the air. When 2 officers approached him, he paused, explained he lived in the complex, and added that he had been away for the weekend, returning from a short trip to Virginia Beach. His name was Norman, the resident of a first-floor unit in the very building where the child had just appeared. The officers explained gently that a child had been missing for 2 days and asked when he had last been home. Upon hearing the details, Norman's expression shifted from confusion to concern. He guided the officers toward his apartment and fumbled briefly with his keys, warning them that the place might be messy from packing. But nothing could have prepared him for the scene inside. The moment he pushed open the door, the air conditioning spilled into the hallway. A steady, consistent flow that had been running since Friday. The scent inside the apartment carried a mixture of dried food, scattered belongings, and something faintly medicinal. The living room looked as though it had been rearranged at high speed by someone with little sense of order. Toys from his children's room were scattered across the carpet, some overturned, some piled strangely near the sofa. A container of shaving cream lay uncapped on the floor, its contents streaked across a cushion and along the side of a wooden table. Norman stood speechless for several seconds, taking in the chaos. It was not the sort of disarray adults made accidentally. It had the unmistakable signature of a small child left alone with unfamiliar objects. Officers, trained to read scenes like this one, began moving carefully around the room, taking in every detail with quiet precision. One of them spotted utensils on the kitchen floor, an assortment of spoons, spatulas, and a fork scattered as though removed one by one and examined. Near the refrigerator lay a small container of cat food, partially emptied, with faint marks suggesting it had been scooped out rather than poured. On the kitchen counter, several cabinets hung open, their contents disturbed. The officers asked Norman whether anything appeared stolen, or whether anyone besides his designated friend had authorization to enter during his absence. He shook his head, still stunned. His colleague had come once to feed his cat, but she had seen nothing unusual earlier in the weekend. If the child had been inside then, he must have been asleep or hiding in a corner unnoticed. One officer examined the bedroom and found more evidence. A small blanket bundled oddly at the foot of the bed, a pillow disturbed, and what appeared to be tiny footprints on the hardwood floor, faint but visible. The closet door had been pushed open, and a few items fell from the shelf as if small hands had tugged at them. A partially eaten packet of crackers lay near the window, left behind as though abandoned halfway through. At one point, a detective crouched beside a low table streaked with dried, matted cream and small fingerprints. He placed his hand beside the markings, not to compare size, but to confirm proportions. They matched the approximate hand width of a 2-year-old. The conclusion formed slowly but firmly in his mind. This apartment had been occupied over the weekend, not by an intruder, but by the child they had been searching for without success. The investigators documented the apartment carefully. Photographs were taken, measurements noted, and objects catalogued. The air conditioning explained why the child had not succumbed to the summer heat. The discarded food items suggested he had found enough to sustain himself, and the toys strewn throughout indicated he had explored freely, turning everything into part of a 2-day adventure without understanding the panic unfolding outside. Norman stood beside the officers, shaking his head in disbelief. "I can't imagine he did all this on his own," he said quietly, but the evidence suggested otherwise. A child left in an unfamiliar but safe environment will often behave in ways that make sense only to them, opening drawers, sampling food, playing with anything that draws their eye. The small cut on his foot likely came from one of the kitchen items scattered on the floor. The missing shirt and diaper, now found near the hallway, were signs of a toddler's unpredictable comfort choices. What puzzled the officers most was how such a space had been overlooked during the search. Norman's door had been unlocked on Saturday morning when the cat was fed, then locked afterward. When officers knocked later, no one had answered, and by protocol they could not force entry without cause or visible sign of danger. The apartment had blended into the larger canvas of the search effort, looking just like any other unoccupied unit. This discovery brought a complicated mixture of relief and lingering astonishment. Relief, because the truth meant the child had been safe all along, protected by cool air, fed by curiosity, surrounded by toys that kept him occupied. Astonishment, because he had been living unnoticed directly beneath the place where volunteers gathered, planned, and worried. The answers they needed had sat less than 100 feet from the command post, hidden not by intent, but by the quiet unpredictability of a toddler's wandering steps. As investigators completed their survey and sealed the apartment temporarily for review, a sense of closure began to form around them. The mystery that had consumed the community for 2 days now shifted into clarity. And while the questions of how and why remained to be explored, the central truth stood firm. The boy had never left the complex. He had simply followed his own small logic into the room below, creating a crisis that neither he nor anyone around him could have foreseen. When the initial relief settled and the investigators finished documenting the scene inside the ground floor apartment, the focus of the case shifted one final time. Not toward suspicion, but toward evaluation. A child had been missing for nearly 48 hours. An entire community had mobilized, emergency teams had been deployed, and resources had been stretched across a wide perimeter. The officers now needed to determine whether anything had occurred that required formal review under state guidelines. It was standard procedure in any prolonged missing child case, even when the outcome was unexpectedly positive. The first point examined was responsibility. The laws in Virginia, like in many states, distinguish between intentional neglect and an unfortunate lapse in supervision. To determine where this particular case fit, investigators reconstructed the timeline with precision. The parents had fallen asleep during the early hours of the morning, not out of disregard, but after a long day's work and an extended stretch of caring for an energetic toddler. The child had mastered the deadbolt on the front door, a fact that came as a surprise to both parents, who had not seen him open it before. The hour he slipped out, around 4:30 a.m., was one during which most neighbors were still asleep. No threats or suspicious individuals had been reported near the building that night. In the legal review, each detail mattered. A finding of intentional wrongdoing would require clear evidence of deliberate failure to provide care or placing the child in a situation known to be unsafe. But in this case, nothing pointed in that direction. Everything indicated a brief moment of exhaustion, a sleeping household, and a toddler whose curiosity outpaced his parents' expectations. The officers building the report noted these details carefully. Cases involving young children often hinged on awareness, whether the guardians reasonably understood the risks and acted accordingly. Here, the risk had come not from the parents' decisions, but from a child's ability to perform an action they had no reason to believe he could. The second point of analysis centered on the child's condition. Medical staff reported that, aside from a minor cut on his foot and mild dehydration, he was in good health. There were no signs of injury or harm beyond what might occur from contact with household items or navigating a space unfamiliar to him. He had access to cool air, which protected him from the intense heat outside. He had located food and water sources on his own. His behavior inside the apartment, the disarray of toys, kitchen utensils, and household items, matched typical exploratory patterns seen in children of his age, not the controlled or restrained behaviors that might suggest outside involvement. Then came the question that many in the community quietly wondered. How could a child remain hidden for so long in a building filled with people searching for him? From a legal standpoint, this was not a point of blame, but a point of oversight. The ground floor unit had been entered by a friend of the resident to feed the cat early in the search window. The child, as later evidence suggested, was likely asleep in the bedroom at that time, undetected. Once the door was locked afterward, he remained effectively concealed without knowing it. Officers had knocked later, but with no signs of forced entry or disturbance, and without authority to enter a locked private residence, they had followed protocol and moved on. No laws had been broken in that chain of events. The circumstances had simply aligned in a way that allowed a child to stay out of sight, despite extensive effort to locate him. Still, the case raised questions beyond the legal minimum. Local authorities conducted an internal assessment to determine whether search procedures should be adjusted in future situations. They considered whether ground floor units in similar layouts might require secondary checks, whether officers should have broader authority during high-risk searches, and whether buildings with numerous families should receive additional guidance on securing doors with child-proof mechanisms. These were not judgments on the parents or the residents, but reflections on the complexities of shared living spaces, where a single unlocked door can create a situation that none of the adults involved anticipated. Experts consulted informally offered several observations. Child development specialists noted that 2-year-olds often move quietly and unpredictably when exploring, especially in unfamiliar surroundings. Forensic specialists reviewed the apartment findings and concluded that the child's 2-day stay aligned with what they saw. Scattered toys, food containers disturbed, and items moved by small hands driven by curiosity rather than fear. A home safety consultant even remarked that the cool air and accessible items likely prevented the situation from becoming serious, a stroke of fortune that could not be dismissed. One small twist remained in the discussion, a question raised by a consultant familiar with search operations. He noted that although many factors aligned to hide the child, unintentionally, the case demonstrated how quickly a missing child situation can shift from local concern to widespread alarm simply because an answer is not immediately visible. It served as a reminder that the absence of evidence does not always indicate distance. Sometimes the truth lies within reach, but remains invisibly positioned between ordinary assumptions. The final legal conclusion reflected all these assessments. The case did not meet the threshold for criminal action. There was no indication of intentional neglect, no sign of interference by an outside party, and no evidence of harm that required further inquiry. The authorities closed the file with a summary noting the unusual but explainable circumstances surrounding the disappearance, the extensive efforts made to locate the child, and the fortunate outcome that allowed him to return home safely. Even as the paperwork settled into its final form, those involved in the case understood that the story itself carried a deeper meaning. It highlighted how quickly fear can spread through a community when a child goes missing, how the smallest gaps in routine can create vast uncertainty, and how a combination of environment, timing, and chance can shape the direction of an entire search effort. It also emphasized a truth known to many family safety specialists. A toddler's movement can defy expectation, leaving adults struggling to make sense of their paths. In the hours after the discovery, as emergency personnel completed their final checks and the search perimeter dissolved, the Stafford Lakes community began its transition from crisis back toward familiarity. The shift did not happen instantly. Relief washed through the complex in waves, first among the officers who had worked through heat and exhaustion, then among the volunteers who had walked mile after mile through the woods, and finally among the residents who had kept their doors shut and their children close during those tense 2 days. Yet even as the searchlights dimmed and vehicles pulled away, the emotional echoes of what had happened remained. Inside the Hill family's apartment, the atmosphere was almost too quiet at first. After 2 days marked by fear, running, questioning, and sleeplessness, the return of their child created a stillness that felt unfamiliar. Leah held her son gently but tightly, as though letting go even for a moment might cause him to slip out of sight again. John alternated between watching the boy and pacing the room with restless energy, trying to absorb the relief while still carrying the tension of what they had experienced. Their son, by contrast, seemed unaware of the gravity of the situation. His curiosity returned quickly. He reached for objects on the coffee table, tugged at the hem of his mother's shirt, and glanced at the living room television as though the last 48 hours were already fading into a blur of sensations he could not yet organize into memory. A few close neighbors came to the doorway to offer support. They spoke softly, sharing their relief, mindful not to overwhelm the family. Many of them had put aside their weekend routines, spent hours searching the grounds, and carried personal worry that a community member's child had disappeared. Seeing the boy safe brought a sense of closure, but also reflection. Several admitted they would be adjusting their own home safety measures, not out of fear, but awareness. What had happened was unusual, but it highlighted how easily a quiet moment in a household could turn into something far larger. As the evening progressed, the media presence outside the complex intensified briefly. Reporters sought to capture the return of the child, gathering footage of officers leaving the scene and interviewing residents who felt comfortable sharing their perspectives. Some neighbors expressed pride in how the community had come together. Others spoke cautiously about the fear they had felt. But the common thread in every comment was gratitude. The story of a missing child often ends in ways people hope not to imagine. To have witnessed an outcome where the child returned unharmed felt, to many, like a narrow escape from possibilities they did not want to revisit. By the next morning, the complex began settling into something closer to its usual rhythm. Children returned to playing outdoors, though under closer watch. Adults resumed their routines, carrying with them the memory of the search that had swept through their homes. Some volunteers who had walked the woods came back to check on the family, offering food or simply a warm greeting. These gestures reflected a truth that had become evident during the crisis. Shared worry had strengthened connections among neighbors who, until then, had mostly exchanged polite greetings rather than meaningful conversations. Meanwhile, investigators finalized their reports. They documented each stage of the search, the details of the apartment where the boy had stayed, and the steps taken to assess the family's actions. Their summary captured the complexity of the case, a combination of timing, an unlocked door, a curious child, and a layout that allowed him to remain hidden during the most intense hours of the search. They noted how the controlled environment of the apartment had protected him from the heat, and explained the small injuries he sustained. The final review concluded that the incident, while alarming, involved no intentional harm or preventable danger beyond the unpredictable behavior of a toddler. For the family, the days that followed were spent adjusting to the reality that the danger had passed. They installed a new lock out of reach, added a small device to alert them if a door opened at night, and rearranged furniture to create a clearer boundary within their home. These steps were taken quietly, not under pressure, but out of a desire to create a sense of control after a situation that had tested the limits of their reassurance. Friends and relatives from farther away called to express concern, offering support and sharing advice. The family found comfort in these conversations, but also recognized that no amount of planning could remove every possibility of surprise. Children, after all, grow faster in curiosity than in caution. What lingered most in the minds of many residents was how easily the child's presence had blended into an ordinary, locked space below. The apartment had been checked from the outside, but not entered, and its quiet interior hid a child who saw the space as a playground rather than an emergency. It reminded adults that the logic of a toddler does not mirror the logic of a search team. A child may interpret an open door not as an exit to danger, but as an invitation to explore. And once inside a room filled with objects stacked at interesting angles and containers that open easily, he may lose track of time and direction completely. As the week progressed, conversations about the incident took on a more reflective tone. People spoke about how quickly fear had moved through the community, how deeply they had imagined scenarios darker than the truth, and how relieved they were to see the outcome take a very different path. Some used the story to caution their own families. Others used it to remind themselves that understanding a situation fully often requires looking beyond assumptions. For John and Leah, the final lesson was quieter but profound. They learned how fragile safety can feel, even in a familiar home. They also learned how quickly strangers become allies when a child is involved. In interviews at the end of the week, Leah expressed gratitude not only for the teams who searched, but for the residents who walked beside them. She said one line that resonated across the complex. "We were not alone, even when it felt like we were holding our breath." What do you think happened during those 2 days? Could a toddler really remain unseen in his own neighborhood? Share your thoughts and tell us, where did you first hear about this story? Your insights help keep these unusual real-life events in view and remembered.